The next sort of biological step is going from cells to something called tissues. So first of all, let's talk about I want to make sure. Okay, that's all right. So from cells to tissues. So here's a cell, a typical cell, right? And it's got a nucleus, and it's got, let's make a little bit of endoplasmic reticulum in there. Woohoo! Other things. There's a cell. A solitary cell performs all the jobs of life on its own. So it has to find its own food, it has to process it, it has to eliminate its own waste, it has to find its own way to get oxygen if it uses oxygen. Some cells don't. They use other things, but whatever they use, they got to find it. And, it has to defend itself, it has to protect itself, it has to find a way to reproduce itself. All of these things are very important jobs for staying alive. And the cell has to do them all. And there are lots of cells that do this. There are lots of cells that live alone as a single cell. For example, the amoeba, right? It's that weird-looking protozoan, the amoeba. Put that O in there for no reason, the amoeba. Another common one that you learn about in school is the paramecium, right? It looks something like this. Has little cilia all over its body, little hairs to move it around, right? The amoeba moves by sort of oozing, kind of like, remember when I told you about phagocytosis, how the cytoplasm stretches and moves, and the membranes stretch. This guy has little cilia that spin it through the water, paramecium. And they're one cell big, so you can't see them unless you have a microscope. And so what you can do is maybe it's a little bit late in the year to find water outside that isn't nearly frozen, but perhaps we can do a little demonstration and look at some of these guys as well. I'll make a note of that. Things we have to do for demonstrations. We have to do osmosis, and maybe we can look at some one-celled creatures under the microscope. I mean, we could Google it, and there's probably lots on YouTube, but it's kind of more cool when you do it from scratch yourself, right? Anyway, there are lots of them. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species of little creatures that live alone as one single cell. But they have to do all the jobs of life. Somewhere in the story of evolution, particular cells began to sort of group together. And we're not really sure exactly how this happens. And when I say they began to group together, I don't mean that on Wednesday everybody was solitary and on Thursday they all started to hold hands. What I mean is, if we go back in time, we can find a sort of space in time, a big region of millions of years, before which we find only single-celled animals, and afterwards we find multicellular organisms. So we say that somewhere in that time, this getting together evolved. We can speculate as to why they did this. If you are a small, let's say there's this big giant amoeba here, scary big amoeba, and then you are a little cell like this, you're going to get eaten up. You're going to get phagocytosized, if that's even a word, right? Glump, 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 and you're done. But guess what? If there happens to be, just by chance, it's not like these cells make decisions, if there happens to be 2 or 3 that are sort of hanging out together, they're now a little bit bigger. And so the amoeba is more likely to go after this guy who's alone, because he's easier to digest, easier to grab, and easier to phagocytosize, right? Easier. So that means that these cells over here, who have learned to sort of stick together, have a better chance of survival. So now, in the next generations, genes for staying alone are being erased from the gene pool as the amoebas are eating these poor suckers. But the genes for grouping together are being left behind. So later, that's mostly what you find, are genes for sticking together. That's how evolution works. And so when cells begin to stick together in a group, they can divide up the jobs of life. So it's kind of like if a bunch of you were lost on a desert island. You might say, okay, we're lost. We got to survive on the island. If we all try to do everything, we won't get very far. But if we cooperate, and, if we send the two Averys off to find wood, right? Would you guys like to go find some wood? Sure. And we send some of the other people, I don't know all the names yet. We send Lauren, right? We send Lauren off to find food, and then we send Julia off to find, I don't know, maybe some sticks to build a shelter, and everybody has a particular job, then we can get stuff done faster, right? Maybe we'll take Nicole back there and we'll make her the keeper of the fire, just to keep the fire burning. And Elliot will be in charge of catching fish or something to eat. So we all have a different job, and that's how you survive. So you can imagine that these particular cells right here that are living in this big group, they can afford to sort of divvy up the jobs. And when they do that, we call that cell specialization. So, cells living in groups, whoops, that's supposed to be two words there, in groups. Cells living in groups can divide up the jobs of life. Can't write that fast? Okay. They can divide them up. They can share. So in this group of cells, right, you say, okay, the red guy here, he is going, maybe these guys are on the outside, so they're going to form skin. Maybe there's more of them. Okay? And then maybe this blue guy, okay, your job is to get rid of waste products for all of us. And maybe this yellow guy here, your job is to digest food for all of us. And so on. So they start to pick different jobs. And that's called cell specialization. So cell specialization is when cells choose a very specific job. But they can only do this if they live in a group, right? If you're all by yourself and you're like, okay, I'm going to be the fisher catching person, well, where's your shelter going to come from? There's no fire. You're going to die. So you have to have groups in order to have cell specialization. And so each of these cells begins to pick a new job. All right? Cells that specialize at doing the same job group together to form what's called a tissue. So that's what tissues are. They're groups of cells that have all decided to do the same job. Now, in a human, we have lots of specialized cells. A lot of the cells in our liver have decided to become cells that detoxify. They break down toxic material. A lot of the cells in our skin have decided to become protective layered cells to keep our skin together. A lot of the cells in our nervous system have decided to put all their energy into transmitting electrical signals by concentration gradients and things like that across their membranes, and they've given up on feeding themselves. In fact, nerve cells are so specialized, every nerve cell has to have another cell beside it called a nurse cell, which takes care of it because it can't survive on its own. That's the problem. When you become really good at one thing, you can't be good at everything. So you might be a cardiologist, but you're still going to need some other person who's an expert at fixing your car, right? Because you've devoted all your time to fixing hearts. And so maybe you also need somebody who's really good at, building houses. You don't know how to do that because you spent all your time learning how to fix hearts. So that's what a tissue is. And there are sort of groups of cells that group together and form different kinds of tissues. So let's look at some of the animal tissues. Let's go back to black here. Ooh. Back in black. That was an AC/DC album from back in the 80s. You don't remember that because you were not born. Animal tissues. Okay. Oh, but while we're talking about that too, you might wonder, well, how did my cells decide that? When I'm a little baby, right, all these cells are pretty much ready to go when I'm born. But before I was a born baby, I was a little developing embryo, which came from a single cell. And so you might wonder, how did all my cells start deciding? And the truth is, we really don't totally understand. But we do know that from that single cell, your mother's egg, as it begins to divide and grow, at some point in that development, different cells begin to differentiate, and they begin to pick a special job and become specialized, and they form the different tissues. Before they do that, they're called stem cells, which means they haven't picked their job yet. So stem cells are like little sort of teenager cells that are still waiting to find out what they're going to be when they grow up, right? They don't know if they're going to be a liver cell or a cardiac muscle cell or a nerve cell. They're waiting to find out. And we can do cool things with them. We can put them in a room with a bunch of other cells, and they'll pick that job, which is cool. So we can take a bunch of nerve cells, right? Maybe your spinal cord is ripped or torn. Nerve cells can't fix the gap because nerve cells cannot reproduce themselves in your spinal cord. So what we do is we take little baby stem cells that have not picked their job yet. We put them in there. They look around and go, hey, everybody here is a nerve cell. I guess that's what I'll be too. And they suddenly grow into a nerve cell, and they can fix the gap. And we're working on fixing spinal cord injuries by using these stem cells, which is pretty cool. Okay, so some animal tissues. Basically, there's a few main types. The first is called epithelial tissue. It's a big word, epithelial. Epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue has a number of different jobs. Essentially, they are tissues that make sheets. They form fat sheets, skins, membranes. Like when I say membranes, what I mean is like not cell membranes, but larger membranous structures, right? Sheets and skins and membranes and so on. So in our bodies, we have lots of these. The most important, of course, is our skin. Skin cells are made of epithelial tissue. Well, I should say skin cells form epithelial tissue, right? So they often form linings. If you think about it, all of your organs, they have sort of an outside, they have like a little bit of a skin around them, right, to hold them together. And then there's another kind of epithelial cell that forms, like they can form tubes, so they can line the small intestine, they can line the stomach, linings, skins, and so on in our bodies. A lot of them have a job of secreting. They can secrete substances. Our skin cells secrete greases and oils to protect and keep our skin waterproof. The cells in our intestines and in some of our organs can secrete particular chemicals that we need. So that's the job that these epithelial cells have taken up. And we find them all over our body, wherever we see different kinds of skins and membranes and linings. Okay? Secreting substances. Let's put an S on there. Yeah, secreting. The next type of tissue is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is a very important specialized kind of cell. Muscle cells do very important things. They can contract. When they get together, they form layers of tissue that can push and pull by contracting. And it's a very complicated bonding structure between these cells, and it involves calcium. You need lots of calcium to make this work, which is why calcium is an important thing in our diet. And muscle cells, of course, can basically, they can contract. The cells themselves don't contract, but they form layers. And the layers of cells, they're called actin and myosin. They work together, and they can sort of move upon each other, and they can make muscle cells expand and contract. So there's basically contracting tissue, is what I'm going to put here. And that's how muscles work. And there's three different kinds of muscle cells. There's the skeletal muscles. Let's spell that right. Skeletal muscles. That says muscles. You can also have what's called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is the muscle that's found in your body. It's not attached to your skeleton. It forms things like sphincter muscles, which are circular muscles that can squeeze and open and close. And when they do that, they can sort of open and close tubes, like your stomach has two of these sphincters on it, which can close to keep the contents of the stomach inside, so it doesn't squirt back up your esophagus and into your mouth, right? Or it doesn't go down into your intestines before it's ready. So smooth muscle, the iris of your eye, the color part of your eye, it squeezes and opens. And what it does is it makes the black part, which is essentially just a hole into your eye, makes it bigger or smaller to let in different amounts of light, right? So smooth muscles do those kinds of things. Smooth muscles also squeeze your intestines and make the food move through, right? That's another reason for them. And then there's one other kind. It's a very special kind of muscle called cardiac muscle. The cardiac muscle makes up heart tissue. Cardiac muscle. And the heart, of course, is the major pump that pumps the blood around the body, and it has to keep on pumping. If you ever think about it, your heart beats, boom, 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 right? Pretty much around once a second, maybe a little more, for your entire life, and it never takes a rest. Imagine, doing chin-ups or push-ups. Maybe you get through 6, 8, or 10, and you're exhausted. You say, okay, that's it, I got to rest. But your heart just keeps on going, and it just keeps on pumping hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of, maybe millions of times over your lifetime without ever taking a rest. Because if it did take a rest, well, a resting of the heart is a heart attack. That's bad news, right? So those are the muscle tissues. And then we have another kind of tissue called nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is very special. Nervous tissue has specialized to transmit signals in a very complicated way that involves the membrane, and it involves the charged ions of calcium, potassium, sodium, all of these things moving in and out of the membranes, causing gradients of charge or voltages that can be sent as a signal. So they transmit signals, and I told you that they're so good at this job that they've abandoned most of the other jobs, and they can't even survive on their own without another cell to help them. Nervous tissue. Okay? And then, of course, we have the last one, which is connective tissue. Connective tissue. And there's three kinds. There's bone. We all know what bone is for. We all think bone is sort of to give us a skeleton, and it's true, it is. But the first purpose of bone, way back in evolution, was to have a little calcium storage deposit in your body. And then it became a skeleton later, and we sort of utilized it. Was like, oh, hey, we already have this, so let's also put muscles on it and make a skeleton out of it. So it kind of evolved. So there's bone tissue. There's also fat tissue. And then one more being your blood. Blood is considered to be a connective tissue. And in a way, all of these tissues, they do sort of connect various parts of our body together, don't they? That's kind of why they're named that. Bone, fat, and blood. So these are the jobs, right? All the jobs of life, like obtaining food. Well, if you think about your digestive system, that involves tubes and membranes and skins, right, to form the structures. It involves secreting substances, juices from your stomach, hydrochloric acids and digestive juices like pepsin and things like that. Your pancreas secretes juices into the intestine. There's lots of secretions, saliva, A lot of goo goes into digesting your food. So those are all those cells that are doing those jobs. It requires muscles to move the food through. Your stomach has muscle in it, smooth muscle that can contract the stomach and cause digestion physically. So those tissues are involved. And of course, there are nerve signals involved. When you feel hungry, that's a nerve thing. Your brain is turned on. And the brain controls a lot of the things that happen with your digestive system. And then, of course, the connective tissue is sort of part of the whole support structure that keeps everything together as well. The digestive system relies on the bloodstream to move all of the lovely things it's digested around the body and make sure the cells get it. So you can see how the big jobs of life are performed by many of these smaller jobs all working together. So far, so good. Okay. Now, those are the tissues. What then happens is tissues also group together. Whoa, just went crazy there. Tissues also group together. As I just said, you might need 2 or 3 of those tissues cooperating to get a job done, right? In order to eat, for instance, we need several of those different tissues to kind of cooperate. So tissues group together to form these major centers of operation, which are called organs. So an organ is kind of like an entire office building. Some people are bringing the mail, some people are doing marketing, some people are worrying about finances, and some people are maybe manufacturing, and right? All the different jobs are happening. And the company or the building is providing something. Maybe it's making masks for COVID people. There's an end product, right? And so in a way, an organ like your liver actually has several different tissues in there, and they're all doing their jobs. And the end result is that the liver is detoxifying toxins that come into our digestive system or into our bloodstream. The liver is also managing our fat and lipids, right? Using cholesterol. That's what our liver also does. It breaks them up, breaks them down, or puts them together. The liver also does, well, the liver is one of the most important organs. It does about 1,000 different things, right? Your kidney has different tissues grouped together, and what it's doing, of course, the kidney's job is it's a building in your body that is in charge of getting rid of waste products from your bloodstream. And it uses all these different tissues to make that happen, all these different little departments, right, within the building. And then, okay, so to form organs. So organs could be like the kidney, for example, or let's put example here. The kidney, the spleen, the heart. Your skin is actually an organ. It's a complex thing. Your skin isn't just one layer. It's many layers of slightly different tissues that all do different things. Your brain, and all of the different organs, etc., in the body. Right? But just like a building has many different departments, organs usually are made of more than one kind of tissue, all working together. And then, if you're a really big company, you might not have one building. You might have several buildings, scattered all over the country in different cities that coordinate with each other, right? So organs often work together in what we call systems, or organ systems. Organ systems. And so we talk about organ systems like the digestive system. Well, that involves many different buildings, many different organs, right? The digestive system involves the spleen, the esophagus, not the spleen, sorry, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines and all its parts, the colon, the mouth, the tongue, the throat, the pharynx, and all those little organs form the digestive system. The circulatory system is a good example. It involves the heart, it involves the arteries, it involves the veins and capillaries, and all of the things that go along with that. The respiratory system, that's the whole company that's designed to get oxygen into your body. It involves the lungs. It involves the larynx. It involves the trachea. It involves the nose and the mouth and all these other things, right? Very complex. And there's several systems in your body. We could go on. These are the three that we're going to look at in detail, by the way. That's why I chose them as examples. But there's the skeletal system. There's the muscular system. If you're interested in the muscular system and you take exercise science next year, or kinesiology, I don't know what they call it anymore. I think they call it kinesiology now. You got to learn a lot about muscles and all the muscles and bones. And so you'll spend a lot of time doing that. This little guy over here will become your friend, right? Lots of different systems in the body. The nervous system, your brain and spinal cord and so on. So that's kind of like the organization. So what you have to remember, to kind of sum up, is that you have a single cell that could live by itself, like a paramecium or an amoeba. But evolution has sort of decided that it makes more sense to live together and cooperate. And so the cells have grouped together and they've decided to do specific jobs, which is what we call cell specialization. And when they specialize, they become a special job cell. And that means they are now a tissue when they get together. All the cells that do the secreting are, for instance, epithelial tissue and so on. And then the tissues form organs. Organs are formed by different tissues working together, right? In a way, you could think of the cells like people and the tissues like the departments within a building, the accounting department, the marketing department, right? The building itself is like the organs, which are getting the whole job done. And then many of these buildings would be interconnected in a big company to get the big job of staying alive done, which would be the entire human body, or the systems, right? The digestive and circulatory and respiratory systems. And that's sort of the organizational hierarchy of it all. So we'll stop there.